Golden light spilled across the Napa Valley like molten honey, catching on rows of Cabernet vines heavy with fruit. From a distance, the Blackwell estate looked like a kingdom about to crown its prince. A wedding marquee rising beside the old stone cellar, strings of white lights glimmering like captured stars. Ethan Blackwell walked the rows slowly, fingertips brushing the grapes as if reassuring himself they were real. This land was more than soil to him. It was legacy, memory, and the promise of a future he had been raised to inherit. He could already hear the murmur of arriving guests up at the main house. In a few hours he would marry Claire Donovan, radiant, ambitious, the girl who had arrived as a summer intern 5 years earlier and never really left his life. And tomorrow he would sign papers formally making him the controlling partner of Blackwell Wines, a deal his father had envisioned since Ethan was a boy. Love, legacy, and a family business, the three pillars of his life were about to align. Yet, as he paused at the edge of the vineyard, a faint unease flickered. The workers he had known since childhood were quieter than usual. His mother's smile had been brittle at lunch. Even Claire had spent the afternoon taking calls in a guest room rather than with him. Ethan pushed it aside. Weddings were stressful, deals were complicated, tonight would fix everything. Up at the house, the celebration looked perfect. Crystal glasses clinked, music drifted from the terrace, and candles flickered in tall hurricane lamps. Ryan Hale, Ethan's oldest friend, practically a brother, stood near the stage, greeting guests with the easy charm that had made him indispensable to the company. Ryan had been his groomsman, his confidant, the one who convinced him to bring in outside investors. Seeing him there relaxed Ethan. If Ryan was smiling, things were under control. The first crack came during dinner. A subtle shift, a glance between Claire and Ryan that Ethan couldn't decipher. Then the lights dimmed and Ryan tapped a microphone for attention. Ethan expected a toast. Instead, Ryan's voice rolled out like a verdict. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate a new era for Blackwell Wines. As of this evening, Hale Global has acquired controlling interest in the company. Effective immediately, operations will transition under our management. This is the dawn of something extraordinary. At first, Ethan thought it was a joke. The room erupted in applause from investors he didn't recognize. He looked to Claire for an explanation, but she avoided his eyes. On the projector screen behind Ryan, a slide appeared, Blackwell Hale Wines Executive Team. Under Chief Brand Officer was Claire's name. The applause blurred. Ethan heard his own heartbeat like a drum. "What is this?" he whispered, but no one answered. Ryan smiled a politician's smile. "Ethan will be stepping back to pursue personal interests," he said smoothly. "We thank him for his years of stewardship." In 1 minute, the vineyard that had been his birthright was gone. The marriage that was supposed to begin tomorrow had been signed away tonight. Lawyers in the crowd passed papers for signatures as flashbulbs popped. Someone put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Security, ushering him from his own engagement party. Outside, the evening air smelled of crushed grapes and betrayal. The marquee lights burned behind him, like a false dawn. Through the French doors, he could see Claire laughing nervously beside Ryan, champagne glass trembling. Ethan's mother sat rigid at a table, her eyes fixed on her plate. He realized everyone had known except him. He walked down the gravel path toward the vines, the sound of celebration fading into insect hum. His hands were shaking, but his mind felt eerily clear. Above the hills, the sunset bled red and orange, the same colors as the Blackwell label he had designed years ago. He thought of his father's voice, "Never let outsiders run the heart of the land," and felt something inside him splinter. At the edge of the property, he turned back one last time. The estate glowed like a jewel stolen from its setting. The music swelled, and in that burning light, Ethan Blackwell made a silent vow. He would vanish from their world, but he would not forgive. Not Ryan, not Claire, not the machine that had devoured his family. The harvest they had stolen would one day turn to ashes in their mouths. Rain misted down over Oregon's Willamette Valley, soft and steady, nothing like the sun-baked rose of Napa. Ethan Blackwell stepped off the Greyhound bus with one duffel bag and no name. In the local newspaper, his disgrace was a one-day headline, then forgotten, but here among strangers he could be no one at all. He watched the bus pull away, leaving him on a cracked 2-lane road flanked by skeletal vines and mist. He whispered the name he had chosen for himself, Nathan Ellis. It didn't sound heroic, it sounded anonymous. That was exactly what he needed. The first months blurred into mud and aching muscles. Nathan clipped vines, washed barrels, and hauled hoses in the pre-dawn cold for minimum wage at small family wineries. No one asked questions. He was just another pair of calloused hands. A drifter with sharp eyes who worked double shifts and read thick books on his lunch breaks. Each night in his rented trailer, he pored over trade journals, law blogs, and SEC filings under a dim lamp, teaching himself the language of the people who had destroyed him. While his body toughened, his mind sharpened. He learned how shell corporations could hide ownership, how offshore trusts shielded assets, how quality ratings could be manipulated and markets steered. He started attending free business webinars under burner emails. The vineyard crews thought he was shy. In reality, he was plotting. He began small, reselling rare vintages online, then brokering bulk wine under pseudonyms, slowly building a network of contacts who never knew his real identity. By the second year, Nathan Ellis was no longer a laborer. He was a ghost moving through the wine world's back corridors, introducing boutique labels to overseas buyers, arranging loans for struggling estates through intermediaries he controlled. He never signed anything in his own name. Every contract was a mirror, reflecting another mirror. He used the last of his trust fund. At night, he walked the rows of whichever property he was advising, breathing in the scent of fermenting grapes, whispering to himself the mantra that had replaced prayer: learn their tricks, beat them at their own game. He wasn't sure when the ache of betrayal turned into a cool satisfaction at each new skill mastered, but it did. The naive heir died in California, the strategist was born in Oregon. He took risks. He hired a retired SEC investigator as a wine quality consultant, paying cash for his insights into fraud cases. He cultivated 2 tech-savvy siblings from a local college who built anonymous payment gateways for him in exchange for tuition. And in a windowless storage unit, he stored the artifacts of his old life, photos, and one folded wedding invitation, reminders of what he had lost and why he couldn't stop. 3 years in, a Nubu brand quietly appeared on the high-end market. Ellis Cellars, a limited production Pinot Noir, praised for mystique and flawless execution. Critics called it a phantom vintage, its owner unknown. Nathan made sure of that. Each bottle was a chess piece moving across a global board, earning him silent credibility and capital while keeping his face out of the spotlight. By the 4th year, the Mercer web stretched silently across 3 continents. Through anonymous trusts, he'd seeded cash in Manhattan venture groups, secured a bottling license in Catalonia, and behind 3 shell firms, acquired the transport company funneling shipments for Hale Global. From a quiet townhouse, Daniel Mercer studied Ryan and Claire like a biologist mapping predators. Every press release, court notice, trade memo became a data point in his private vault. To outsiders, they were untouchable, glittering galas, glossy covers, but Daniel's trained eye detected fishers, ballooning loans, reckless expansion, whispers of a ruined harvest. Sometimes, past midnight, he caught himself looking at Claire with a strange, clinical fascination. She'd outplayed him once. How would she respond when the board flipped? He shoved the thought aside and worked harder. Otermation arrived on a rainy Tuesday. In a rented office above a coffee roaster, Daniel scrolled through shipping logs on one monitor while a muted business channel ran on the other. The anchor teased the upcoming Napa Valley World Wine Forum, an invitation-only event for the elite. He barely glanced up until the hosts appeared on screen, Ryan Hale and Claire Donovan Hale, smiling outside the historic Crestwood estate. A week later, a heavy cream envelope landed at one of Daniel's drop boxes. Inside, an embossed card on thick stock, You are cordially invited to the inaugural Napa Valley World Wine Forum at the historic Crestwood estate. It bore the name Daniel Mercer, Mercer Vineyards, featured award honoree. He stared at the paper, hands trembling. The vineyard stolen from him had summoned him back under his new identity, stage set, spotlight waiting. A trophy and a gauntlet in one, he rose, unlocked a steel locker in the corner. Relics of his past gleamed in the dimness, the old wedding invitation, a tarnished crest, a corked bottle from his final harvest. He twisted it open, poured a harsh splash into a paper cup. The wine had aged like betrayal, bitter and sharp. He drank anyway. The ghost of Alexander Crestwood stirred within him. Daniel Mercer folded the invitation, slid it into his jacket, and allowed himself a cold smile. The forum would be his entrance and their ruin. Morning fog rolled over the valley, curling around the spires of cypress and the tiled roofs of the Blackwell estate like pale smoke. From the driveway, the mansion looked almost unreal, a stone citadel perched above the vines, dressed up for the cameras and the summit's VIP guests. Limousines lined the gravel, their engines purring softly. Nathan Ellis stepped out of a Blacktown car and onto the Doppin, same soil where Ethan Blackwell had once played tag between barrels, but the man who emerged now bore little resemblance to that boy. He moved like someone who measured every gesture, each step calculated. His eyes, once warm, open, eager to please, were a colder blue now, glinting like a blade under the summit's banners. In the reflection of the glass doors, he hardly recognized himself, and that was the point. Inside, the summit buzzed with wealth and ambition. Waiters floated past with trays of amuse-bouches and gleaming flutes of sparkling wine. Sustenance showed looping videos of Blackwell Hale wines, innovation with tradition. Ryan Hale strode from group to group, shaking hands, his smile broadcast ready. Claire followed a step behind, in a white dress cut like armor, greeting dignitaries and foreign investors. Neither gave Nathan more than a polite glance when he was introduced as the elusive owner of Ellis Cellars, this year's award winner for Best Emerging Label. Now, the handshake was brief, Ryan's grip was firm but distracted, his attention already shifting to a senator across the room. Claire's fingers brushed Nathan's for an instant, her eyes flicking over his face without recognition. Nathan forced a courteous smile. Inside, his heart thudded once like a hammer, then went still. 4 years of reinvention had worked. To them, he was just another rival with good wine. He moved through the estate as if seeing it for the first time, and in a way he was. The tasting room had been remodeled into a showroom, all glass and chrome. The old cellar now boasted an innovation lab funded by tech-savvy investors. Yet beneath the glossy surface, he sensed the weak beams, invoices stacked on unsecured desks, junior staff gossiping about unpaid bonuses, suppliers complaining of delayed payments. He caught fragments of conversation in hallways: bridge loan, emergency shipment, private settlement, each one a thread leading to a crack in the facade. Nathan lingered by a window overlooking the south vineyard where he had once helped his father plant new vines. A memory nipped through him, his father's calloused hand on his shoulder, the smell of soil and oak. He blinked it away, focusing instead on the spreadsheet a careless assistant had left open on a tablet nearby. I knew way. Numbers out of alignment. Inventory mysteriously lost, classic signs of skimming or desperate juggling. He filed it away in his mind's private ledger. He toured the barrel room, complimented the new bottling line, listened politely to a marketing director pitch a heritage campaign using photos of Ethan as a child, now repackaged as stock imagery. Each site was a small cut, but he didn't bleed. He took notes, stored faces, memorized access codes when staff swiped badges. Every vulnerability was a future lever. By late afternoon, the summit shifted into breakout sessions. Ryan was in back-to-back meetings with investors. Claire was cornered by a foreign buyer, a brittle smile plastered across her face. Nathan excused himself from a panel on global supply chains and slipped into a side corridor lined with framed awards. He walked like a guest, but thought like a thief. At the end of the hall was Ryan's private office, oak door, brass handle, keypad lock. Years ago, Ethan had been in and out of that room freely. Now Nathan stood outside as a stranger. He knelt briefly, pretending to tie his shoe, and slid a wafer-thin device from his cuff link. It looked like a tie pin, but was in fact a high-end digital recorder with an encrypted transmitter, bought through a shell company and untraceable. He entered the code he'd memorized from an earlier staff demonstration. Ryan's laziness hadn't changed, and the door clicked open. The office smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne. Files lay in neat stacks, a laptop blinking on the desk. Photos of Ryan and Claire at galas lined the shelves where Ethan's family pictures used to sit. He moved quickly, methodically, his pulse loud in his ears. He placed the device under the lip of the desk, pressing until the adhesive caught. A tiny green light blinked once, then went dark. From this spot, it would capture every word spoken in the office. Transmitting to a secure server Nathan controlled miles away. Endurance, evidence, ammunition. For a heartbeat he froze, looking at the leather chair where Ryan now sat as king. He imagined Ryan leaning back, plotting, laughing. He imagined the sound of his father's car crashing on a dark road, the file he had found years later. The tremor that ran through his hand surprised him. He clenched it into a fist until the shaking stopped. Then, composed again, he straightened his tie, glanced around to ensure nothing looked disturbed, and slipped back into the corridor. In the tasting hall, the applause from a guest speaker swelled, covering the sound of the door clicking shut behind him. Nathan walked toward the noise with a neutral expression, but in his eyes a storm gathered. The ghost had returned to his old house. This time he wasn't leaving empty-handed. For the guests and journalists drifting through the summit, the Blackwell Hale partnership still shimmered with the glow of success. The wine was flowing, the press releases sang of innovation, and the host smiled for every camera. But behind the curated image, small tremors were starting to shake the foundations. Tremors that only Nathan knew he had set in motion. It began with suppliers. In the weeks leading up to the summit, He had quietly approached several key growers who provided grapes for Blackwell Hale's premium vintages. Through intermediaries, he offered them better contracts, faster payments, and an aura of exclusivity under a new boutique distribution company, one that, unbeknownst to them, Nathan controlled. All he asked in return was confidentiality. Farmers who had once been loyal to Ryan suddenly shifted their best fruit elsewhere. Blackwell Hale's next harvest would be short before it even began. Then came the whispers. Nathan had cultivated a handful of wine bloggers and industry insiders during his years in Oregon, feeding them rare samples, juicy tidbits, and leaks that always proved accurate. Now he gave them a new story, an anonymous source claiming Blackwell Hale's flagship vintage had inconsistencies in quality control. And Raidements, mostly due to cutting corners, he didn't make outright accusations, he simply seeded questions. In an industry built on prestige and perception, questions were enough to erode confidence. Caused for Persabiro. By day, Nathan attended Persh and Sforborough. By day, Nathan attended panels, tasting sessions, and investor luncheons with cool charm. By night, he worked his chessboard. He instructed his tech contacts to create shell profiles that infiltrated investor forums, sowing doubt about Blackwell Hale's balance sheet and hinting at a better opportunity with a discreet new syndicate, again, one he secretly ran. Slowly, some of Ryan's investors began moving capital into Nathan's hidden fund, believing they were hedging their bets. In reality, they were bankrolling their host's future destroyer, but Nathan's most delicate move was reserved for Claire. Of all the betrayals, hers had been the deepest, and he wanted her undoing to feel like a haunting. In the weeks before the summit, he had studied her old handwriting, her favorite stationery, every love note she had once sent him. Now anonymous envelopes began appearing in her dressing room, at her hotel, even slipped into her handbag. Each note was only a few lines long, fragments of phrases she herself had written years ago, twisted into cryptic warnings, that her tenured members, hasbaber, a toast to the man you left behind. Every harvest begins with buried seeds. To anyone else they would be meaningless. To Claire, they were ghosts from her own pen. She started losing sleep, arriving late to meetings, snapping at assistants. At dinners, Nathan watched from across the room as she forced a smile, eyes flicking nervously to the corners as if expecting a camera flash or an accusation. He didn't approach her, he didn't need to. The notes were already working. Inside their mansion, the cracks widened. Stoff whispered about shouting matches behind closed doors. Ryan's temper, once a controlled performance, now erupted over minor setbacks. The unpaid bonuses Nathan had overheard became public when a supplier filed a small claims suit. A tabloid picked up a rumor about contamination in Blackwell Hale's upcoming vintage, citing industry insiders. Investors called at odd hours demanding reassurances. Like wine left too long in heat, the facade was beginning to sour. Nathan orchestrated it all with patient precision. He didn't strike directly, he guided. He gave Ryan and Claire just enough rope to tighten around themselves. Each move mirrored a winemaking process: crush, ferment, rack, bottle. Revenge like wine needed. One rainy afternoon during the summit's second week, Nathan sat in a hotel room overlooking the valley, laptop open to his secure server. The listening device in Ryan's office had been streaming hours of conversations, contract negotiations, frantic calls to bankers, even a private argument where Ryan accused Claire of sabotage. Nathan saved each file, tagging them for later use. Evidence was a vintage, too. It had to be cellared until just the right moment. He poured himself a glass of his own Ellis Pinot Noir and watched a live feed of an industry blogger's channel. The host was speculating about rumblings at Blackwell Hale, citing anonymous tips about supply shortages and mysterious new competitors. In the chat window, bots Nathan's team controlled amplified the rumors. The stock of confidence was dropping by the hour. Meanwhile, Claire received another note. This one arrived in her private dressing room just before a press interview. It contained only 5 words: "Your past will be uncorked." She went pale and canceled the interview, citing illness. A photographer snapped a picture of her leaving through a side door, eyes hidden behind sunglasses. Within hours, the image circulated online under headlines about trouble behind the power couple. By the end of the summit's final day, Ryan looked tired for the first time Nathan could remember. His tan seemed sallow under the lights, his smile brittle. In a hallway, Nathan overheard him barking at a subordinate about a contamination issue in the new vintage. A problem, with barrels that had passed quality control months ago but now tested high for volatile acidity. Nathan knew exactly why. A discreet shipment of tainted cleaning solution had reached the cooperage weeks earlier, routed through a supplier Nathan indirectly controlled. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, but enough to ruin a batch and force a costly recall. That night, Ryan stormed into his office and slammed the door. The listening device caught every word as he called a consultant, demanding answers. "Someone's behind this," he hissed. "I want names," the consultant mumbled about chance, about bad luck. Ryan wasn't convinced. Across town, in his anonymous hotel, Nathan listened with his headphones on, eyes half closed. The voice of his former best friend reached him like a radio transmission from another world. Angry, panicked, still certain of his own power, Nathan muted the feed and sat back. His hands trembled for a moment, not with fear but with a surge of something darker, a mix of triumph and the echo of old pain. He steadied them on the desk until the shaking stopped. On his screen, a new message blinked from one of his shell investors: funds transferred, phase 2 complete. Nathan closed the laptop. Outside, the lights of the Blackwell estate glimmered like a ship about to sink, unaware of the slow leak below deck. He rose, poured the rest of the wine into the sink, and looked at his reflection in the window. The face staring back was calm, almost serene. The ghost had learned to play chess. Rain swept across the Napa Valley like a gray curtain the morning Nathan launched the next phase of his plan. Blackwell Hale's summit had ended, but the aftershocks were only beginning. Investors whispered, journalists circled, and suppliers hedged their bets. Nathan, still in the guise of Nathan Ellis, moved like a shadow through the chaos he had created, each step timed to an invisible clock. The first strike was financial. Through his offshore syndicate, he quietly called in short-term loans he'd extended to several of Ryan's silent partners. They'd borrowed to fund expansions and renovations at the Blackwell estate, never realizing the boutique investor behind the loans was the man they had helped ruin years ago. Now, repayment notices arrived simultaneously, demanding sums due within 30 days. Panic rippled through Ryan's circle as one partner after another realized they were leveraged to the hilt. Some tried to sell their shares, others begged Ryan for buyouts. Cash began bleeding from the business faster than it came in. The second strike was reputational. Nathan leaked edited snippets from Ryan's own office recordings, not enough to expose himself, just enough to make Ryan look reckless. A popular wine industry blog published an exclusive about the contamination issue, quoting a supposed insider who accused management of cutting corners to chase profits. Investors called for audits, and 2 restaurant chains quietly removed Blackwell Hale's wine from their menus, pending quality review. On social media, bots Nathan controlled amplified every story, turning small tremors into a rolling earthquake. And at the same time, Claire's unraveling accelerated. The anonymous notes had done their work. Nathan added a more personal touch. He arranged for a courier to deliver a single bottle of wine to her private office, a vintage she had once blended with Ethan for their wedding reception, never publicly released. The label bore no name, only the date of their canceled wedding in gold foil. Inside the cork was a hidden microchip containing a recording, Claire's own voice from years ago, reading vows she had never spoken at the altar. When she played it trembling, she understood only one thing. Someone knew her most intimate past, and that someone was close enough to slip gifts into her locked office. Arguments between her and Ryan turned violent in tone, if not in action. Staff overheard slamming doors, muffled sobs. Ryan accused her of leaking documents. She accused him of paranoia. The mansion, once a stage for their triumph, now echoed with suspicion. Nathan watched it all from a distance, documenting every fracture. Revenge, he told himself, wasn't about a single strike. It was about erosion. You let the cliff crumble until one day the house at the top slid into the sea. But he also knew the endgame was approaching. His hidden company had absorbed enough of Ryan's suppliers and investors to launch a public challenge. The contamination scandal had made Blackwell Hale's upcoming vintage unsellable without massive discounts, and the loans he'd orchestrated were coming due. The power couple who had stolen his future were cornered, but cornered prey was dangerous. One night, while monitoring the listening device, Nathan heard something new, Ryan talking to a private investigator. "Find him," Ryan said. "Whoever's behind this, I want a name." The PI asked for details. Ryan mentioned the notes to Claire, the supplier exodus, the loan calls. Nathan listened, expressionless, but his pulse quickened. He'd built layers of protection, but if Ryan got desperate enough, he might trace one of the shells back to Oregon. Time to tighten the net. He made a call to a journalist he trusted. An anonymous source would provide documents proving mismanagement at Blackwell Hale, financial records, contamination reports, even the PI contract. The journalist agreed to publish within days. When the story broke, regulators would follow. Ryan would have no room to maneuver. On a foggy afternoon, Nathan drove up to a ridge overlooking the estate. Through binoculars, he watched trucks hauling barrels out of the cellar. The contamination had forced Ryan to recall hundreds of gallons of wine. Each barrel rolling up the ramp was money lost, reputation drained. Nathan imagined the liquid inside as years of his stolen life poured out onto the ground. He didn't smile. This wasn't joy, this was justice measured in vintages. Below in the courtyard, Claire stood alone, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the trucks. For a moment, Nathan felt the old ache of what they had once been. Then he remembered the wedding day, her hand in Ryan's, as they signed away his legacy. He lowered the binoculars. Back in his car, he opened his laptop. A new message from his attorney flashed on screen. Acquisition documents finalized. We're ready when you are. It meant the last move. A hostile takeover of the vineyard's remaining assets through a third-party shell was prepared. All he had to do was sign. Nathan looked at the estate one more time, the rows of vines stretching like scars across the valley. Revenge had fermented long enough. It was almost time to pour. He closed the laptop, started the engine, and drove away into the mist, leaving behind the image of Ryan and Claire's empire collapsing like a rotting barrel. The invitation arrived on thick ivory paper sealed with wax, no return address, an exclusive evening. A tasting of vintages never before poured, RSVP required. Ryan saw it first, thrown onto his desk by an assistant who didn't know what else to do with it. Claire received hers separately at home. Both carried only a time, a set of coordinates in the hills north of the valley, and the name of the host, Nathan Ellis, the man whose wine label was suddenly eclipsing theirs. Curiosity, pride, and desperation mixed in equal measure. Ryan needed investors, Claire needed answers. Against her better judgment, she accompanied him. Night had fallen when their car left the paved road for a winding track through oaks. The GPS dropped out. At the crest of a hill, an iron gate swung open by remote, admitting them into a courtyard lit by torches. Beyond the stone facade of a converted monastery stood an arched door carved with grapevines. Two silent attendants led them inside. The dining hall was all shadows and candlelight. Vaulted ceilings, barrels lining the walls, a single table set for three, with crystal stemware glinting like icicles. The air smelled of oak, wine, and something colder, anticipation. Ryan straightened his tie, scanning for cameras, while Claire rubbed her arms as if chilled. The attendants closed the doors behind them with a muted thud. Locks clicked. From the far end of the hall, a figure emerged, leaner and sharper than the man they remembered. His dark suit fit like armor, his eyes like cut glass. "Welcome," he said, voice steady. "I'm glad you accepted my invitation." They didn't recognize him at first. Not completely. The beard, the posture, the measured confidence, all different. But when he poured the first glass and looked up, Claire's hand trembled. "Ethan?" she whispered. Nathan, Ethan smiled without warmth. "Let's call this a tasting. Every course a memory, every pour, a truth." He lifted the first bottle. "A Pinot from Oregon," he said. "Grown by people you never paid on time. Bought out from under you before you even noticed." Ryan bristled, but said nothing. They drank. The wine was extraordinary, complex, dark, impossible to ignore. The second course arrived with the second bottle. "A blend of investors," Ethan continued. "Your investors, the ones you lured with false promises after you took my inheritance. They belong to me now. Their capital seeded the network that's bleeding you dry." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were signatures, contracts, bank transfers, incontrovertible proof. Ryan's face flushed. "You think this scares me?" he snarled. "You still a nobody with a grudge." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you sweating?" The third bottle he opened himself, letting the cork roll down the table. "This vintage is special. It carries notes of betrayal, fraud, and murder." He placed a safety deposit key beside the cork. "In a bank downtown sits a box containing recordings from your office, copies of wire transfers, and documents about the accident that killed my father. The one you and your contractor staged to push through the takeover. Every page is ready for the authorities." Claire's breath hitched. "Murder?" she whispered. Her eyes darted to Ryan. "You told me it was an accident." Ryan's chair scraped the floor. "He's lying," he snapped. "This is all some twisted performance," but his hands shook. Claire recoiled, understanding dawning in fragments. All the notes, all the tension, she'd been a pawn in a much larger game. Ethan leaned in. "For years you thought you'd buried me, but I learned, I adapted, and now the debt's come due." His voice stayed soft, almost tender. "Tonight isn't about violence, it's about..." Ryan lunged, grabbing for Ethan across the table, but Ethan had planned for that too. One of the silent attendants stepped forward, pressing a discreet taser to Ryan's shoulder. Electricity crackled. Ryan collapsed back into his chair, gasping. Ethan didn't flinch. "Please," he said. "We're in the middle of a tasting." Claire began to cry, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "I didn't know," she kept repeating. "I thought we were building something." I thought. Her gaze fell on Ethan. "What do you want from us?" "Kano, nothing," Ethan said. "Gano, no, nothing." "Nothing," Ethan said. "It's already done." He gestured toward the windows. In the distance, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound of sirens winding through the hills. Blue-white flashes flickered between the trees like fireflies. "I invited you here as a courtesy," Ethan said, "to let you taste what you made of me before the world swallows you." Ryan staggered to his feet. "You called the feds?" Months ago," Ethan replied. "They've been watching ever since the first contamination report. You handed them everything. I just poured the wine." He took a final glass and raised it in a mock toast. To harvests lost and debts paid. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Doors slammed. Voices shouted commands. The candle flames trembled with each footstep approaching the hall. Ryan's eyes darted around for an exit. Claire sank into her chair, face pale as parchment. Ethan placed the safety deposit key gently in front of them. "Parakshan Sepper Coffer Napper Shandashell." "You'll need this," he said. "They'll be asking questions." He turned and walked toward the far door as the main entrance burst open behind him. Federal agents poured in, weapons drawn, barking orders at Ryan and Claire. The last thing Ethan heard as he slipped through the servants' passage was Ryan's voice cracking under the weight of everything collapsing, a strangled mix of rage and disbelief. In the darkness of the corridor, Ethan paused, listening to the chaos he'd orchestrated. Years of planning, exile, and transformation had distilled into this single moment, a vintage of vengeance finally uncorked. He exhaled once, slow and steady, then disappeared into the night. Leaving the agents to their work and his betrayers to their reckoning, dawn slid across the valley like a pale ribbon of smoke. By the time the first rays touched the Blackwell estate, the courtyard was filled with law enforcement vehicles. Agents cataloged barrels, confiscated laptops, and led dazed employees down the stone steps. Ryan Hale, cuffed and furious, shouted about lawyers. Claire sat on the back bumper of a government SUV, blanket around her shoulders, staring at nothing. Miles away, in a small rented cottage on the Oregon coast, Ethan Blackwell watched the scene unfold on a muted newsfeed. The footage had been captured by a local drone pilot and leaked to social media before the feds could clamp down. Even without sound, the images told the whole story: sirens, evidence boxes, a dynasty collapsing in real time. Ethan sipped coffee from a chipped mug. He didn't smile. Not yet. His phone vibrated once, a text from his attorney, deposition scheduled. "Your anonymity intact. Congratulations." Another message from the journalist who had broken the story. "Everything published. You're clean." Essen for mock. Ethan set the phone down and walked to the window. Outside, gulls wheeled over the surf. He had spent 5 years burying his name, building Nathan Ellis from ashes. Now the revenge was finished, the masquerade complete. What remained was a silence he hadn't expected, a hollowness behind the triumph. Justice was intoxicating, but it didn't erase the nights spent alone, the wedding that never happened, the father he couldn't bring back. On the television, the reporter cut from the raid to a stock photo of Ethan Blackwell, the disgraced heir who had vanished years ago. Sources say Blackwell may have been instrumental in tipping off authorities, the anchor said. His whereabouts remain unknown. The old photo showed a softer man, hopeful eyes, and vineyard dirt under his fingernails. Ethan touched the screen briefly, then shut it off. He walked into the kitchen where on the counter sat a single bottle of wine, his own Ellis Reserve, the first vintage he'd ever produced under his false name. He uncorked it slowly, inhaling the aroma. This bottle had been set aside years ago for one purpose, the final pours when it was all over. He carried it outside to a weather-worn table on the cliff. The sea below crashed against black rocks, spindrift rising like ghosts. He poured himself a glass and held it up to the morning light. The wine was dark, almost crimson, catching the sun like a drop of blood. He took a sip, a finish of smoke. Images of the night before flickered in his mind, Ryan's face blanching as the evidence piled up. Claire's trembling hands, Claire's trembling hands, the whiskers trembling, the wail of sirens threading through candlelight. The sound of his own voice saying, "It's already done." Revenge, he thought, was not a single act, but a long fermentation, and now the barrel was empty. A car approached on the gravel drive. Ethan tensed, then relaxed when he saw who it was, the journalist. She stepped out carrying a recorder and a sealed envelope. "You sure you want to do this anonymously?" she asked. "They'll want a face for the story. I've given enough," Ethan said. "Let the evidence speak." She studied him. "You look different than your photo." "I am different." He handed her a flash drive. "This is everything else. Financial records, contracts, the PI transcripts. Make sure they go public if anything happens to me." She nodded. "Your friends are now at Penshri." She nodded. "You're free now, you know. Freedom's a strange word," he murmured. "Sometimes it feels like exile." "You know." She left. The sound of her car faded down the road, leaving only gulls and wind. Ethan finished his glass and poured the rest of the bottle out onto the grass, libation to the man he used to be. Dark rivulets ran between the blades before sinking into the earth. For a long moment he stood there, watching the sea, feeling the weight of years lift and settle all at once. Nay, he turned back toward the cottage, pausing at the threshold. On the table inside lay a new business plan, an offer from European investors to expand Ellis Wines globally. He could accept, step fully into the identity he had created, and vanish into the legitimate world he'd built. Or he could disappear entirely, no more names, no more ghosts. Behind him, the waves kept pounding, as if the ocean itself were uncorking some endless vintage. Ethan glanced once more at the horizon, then closed the door.